Again, from the Richard Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California, with our conference on Richard Nixon and intelligence in the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, we bring you the first of two panels. This panel, led by Matt Penney, deals with perspectives from intelligence analysts, using intelligence to predict ongoing developments during the war. And our chair, Matt Penney, has been with the CIA for 9 years. He's one of 6 historians, history specialists, and this is his specialty. He has a PhD from Rice University. His field is Middle East. It's an area where he's widely traveled and worked over the years, so he knows it well. He documents CIA involvement in all counterintelligence. I'm trying to get my pages opened here. In counterintelligence and counterinsurgency. He has written 2 books and multiple articles on these subjects, and they're all classified. However, they're available in our museum store, which I'm a shameless promoter about our store. Along with, I might add, all of Richard Nixon's best-selling 10 books, including his memoirs, which we just had reprinted. I'm sorry, take that excursion into self-promotion. But ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Matt Penney. There you go, it's all you.
Thank you. We have a fascinating panel here composed of former analysts, so they're going to have a lot of interesting things to say. I should start by saying that as a historian who studies the Middle East, I have to note that what we're doing today here is a bit untrendy. We're bringing new perspectives to a Middle Eastern topic from the Washington viewpoint. If you go to any stylish Middle East history conference, you're not supposed to do that. If you want to bring something new to the field, you use indigenous sources. The new perspectives are from the inside of the Middle East, looking out. You'll see at the conferences or the programs or at the universities, they'll say, the old way of doing Middle Eastern history is to look at it from the outside in. The new way is from the inside out. And then most of the time the resulting products just look like all the other histories anyway. So in today's proceedings, we're quite unapologetically doing it, quote, the old way. The reason we are is that we actually do have new information. Many documents are being released. We do have new perspectives. We're able to say some things now that we have not been before. We have some people who have not engaged extensively with the public before on this program. And also you see that even when you're looking at Washington's view of an issue and how analysts think and behave and write, they do have to understand the region from the middle out. You do have to treat the issue in its own context. We see from some of the documents in this collection, for example, that our analysts did think about the indigenous frameworks of how Syria or Egypt might act. They did consider that Egyptian President Sadat might initiate a conflict he thought he might lose or would lose militarily. And if that wasn't logical by U.S. standards, it made some sense by Egyptian standards to restore Arab prestige, to invite the intervention of the great powers and force a more favorable settlement that may have occurred otherwise. I'll also say a word about just analysts. We make a lot of references today, what analysts said, analysts thought, analysts wrote. Often we're talking about the most formal published record. And I should say that there is a difference between that formal published record and the diversity of thought, the arguments, the debates, the dissent. That occurs at the working level, but often it's minimized in that final product. The final product doesn't show that diversity. It may minimize that dissent. It may also not appreciate that different analytical units saw an issue in different ways. For example, a military analyst might look at a certain buildup and say this is or is not preparatory for war. A political analyst might say, well, that's fundamentally a political or strategic decision, and we disagree, whichever way it goes. You'll also see that there is a difference between working level analysts and the layers of management. Often the more risky thought can get eliminated during the process of review. It's easier to go with the things that are closer to the status quo. And so I expect today we're going to hear some of these perspectives that are below, more granular, and maybe even more interesting than what was the most official final record from the analyst's discourse. I'll also point out that even when analysts do get it right, it may not matter. Policymakers don't always listen to intelligence analysis. Analysts can also get it right, maybe a bit late for it to have had a big effect. I was talking to one analyst who was telling me an anecdote from some years back where the agency assessed that one certain country was going to strike another country. And we were correct. But it was only 2 or 3 days before the strike occurred. And a policymaker was talking to that analyst and said, we appreciated your information, but next time could you give us at least 60 days advance notice? And as you know, that's not how analysis or even history works. It may not be knowable that far in advance. Even that regime may have had a different plan at the time. I'll also note that our perspective changes over time about successes, about failures, about what's transformative. I almost used the trite phrase calling the '73 war a transformative issue in the Middle East. Then I thought, well, that's awfully trite because, if you believe the subtitles of books, there have been dozens of events in the modern Middle East that have transformed the region, so I stayed away from that. Even on Arab Spring right now, or the so-called Arab Spring, there's several books out there ambitiously purporting to be the history of Arab Spring. How remarkable for a kind of awakening that's still in progress. And there's no doubt that Arab Spring, or awakening is really the better term, that's the translation of the Arabic term, is going to be one of these events that we just revisit over time and over time. And who knows, 30 or 40 years from now, we may have an event like this on the Arab uprisings. To close my opening remarks, I'll just say that I recently heard a current analyst make a comment on the state of Syria's present military stockpiles, and he explained their vastness by saying that since 1973, Syria has been aggressively stockpiling weapons in preparation for another possible war with Israel. That those weapons are currently being turned on the Syrian people is a sad fact of the present, but their number and state of readiness are related to the events we're discussing here today, one episode in a long conflict in the Middle East that has occupied so much attention from our intelligence officers and our presidential administrations. So with that, I'll introduce our three panelists. First is Richard Kovar. Dick Kovar is a longtime analyst who worked the Arab-Israeli account in the early 1970s. And he was on the task force that covered the 1973 war. He later served as the editor for the journal, our in-house journal, Studies in Intelligence, and then after that was a PDB editor and briefer. Next is Martha Kessler. Martha is also a longtime agency analyst. Martha Neff Kessler, I should say, because Martha Neff was her name at the time. Martha served 3 tours on the National Intelligence Council with the Middle East portfolio, and she's the author of a book, Syria, A Fragile Mosaic of Power. Last but not least, Dr. Emil Nakhleh came to CIA after 26 years in academia. Dr. Nakhleh founded our PISAP, Political Islam Strategic Analysis Program, and was a founding member of our Senior Analytic Service. So I'm excited to have these panelists here today. I think they're going to bring some interesting and new perspectives, so join me in welcoming them.
Okay, I was chief of the Middle East Task Force formed for the 1973 war, formed of necessity because of the war. And I've been asked to give you pretty much explain the mechanics of how a task force is formed and operates, what its purposes are. This was not the only intelligence task force that was ever formed at CIA. It was the second one that I had been involved with. Charlie Allen has already described a great deal of what we did, and certainly one of the most important components of the daily sit-reps that we produced was the military component. And in that role and in that function, the military analysts truly performed superbly. If we all suffered a tremendous failure of analysis in the run-up to the war, in some ways, the military people in particular made up for it with the superb support that they gave the government as a whole and Dr. Kissinger and the president in particular during this period. So I pay a great deal of tribute to Charlie and the people who did that part of the job. Anyway, this is my take on how the task force came into being. It's somewhat different from Charlie's story. Charlie and the Watch Committee had made their pronunciation Thursday night for the Watch Committee report that was published Friday morning. That afternoon and evening, it was my job to bring up to date the daily publications that would be published the next morning and to give to my boss, Dick Lehman, an update for the Watch Committee in case they wanted to make an interim Watch Committee report. I had finished the drafting of what I was going to hand in, and I was waiting for a final input, which was going to come directly from the horse's mouth because it was going to come from the chiefs of Israeli intelligence. It was coming to us, I think, through Jim Angleton's staff, and I was sitting there in the op center with my draft in front of me and very anxious because we had spent a week of yet more alarms and excursions of troop movements or reported troop movements. The Soviets had had started pulling out their dependents a couple of days before. We'd had some reassurances on that score from Cairo. But we all knew that war could break out at any time. In fact, that is something of the mindset we were working under. And I didn't realize it at the time, but when I've gone back to try to live through those days again, what was maybe uppermost in my mind without my realizing it was there was that if we called this wrong, if we set off an alarm, we could be responsible for starting this war. And it was almost a given that if Israel thought it was about to be attacked, that it would preempt. That was their strategy. That's what their very existence depended on. And so we had to be, all this time, particularly this past week, that's what we were operating against. We couldn't call this thing wrong. We didn't have anything really new. We'd had increments of troop movements, of maneuvers, of training organizations. We'd had a series of reports that I'll tell you about a little later that were very detailed on the Syrian planning to attack the Golan Heights. It was a very anxious moment. And yet, we had this confidence. How could war break out? The Arabs, especially the Egyptians, couldn't attack. They couldn't get across the canal. If they did get even in fact, we had our military people, along with people from the Pentagon, had gone out to the Sinai, and they had walked up and down the canal, and they looked at these huge berms that had been built up on both sides of the canal. The first thing an attacking force had to do was get over its own berm, down into the canal, across the canal somehow, up the side of the canal, over the opposing berm. How was anybody going to attack across that? Okay, I'm sitting here waiting, and the phone rings, and somebody on Angleton's staff has the net assessment of the Israeli intelligence chiefs. I think they must have gotten it in Hebrew because he was dictating it very slowly in English to me. I had a typist on the other phone. And he ran through this, given that this is happening and given that that is happening and this, that, and the other thing. I said, look, the secretary will take down the text. Give me the last line. And the last line was something like that. Given all this, we believe that the chances of any action are low. And it ended right there. I handed the thing over to the typist. I told the typist to take down the rest of the text. I signed off on my draft. I handed it over to Dick Lehman's secretary. And for the first time in certainly weeks, instead of hanging around the op center, I was going to go out and have dinner. And I did. I was so sure. If the Israelis said nothing's going to happen, nothing's going to happen. I went home. I went out to dinner. I got home late. I went to bed. The phone rang. Unlike Charlie Allen, I wasn't called until the attack actually occurred. The op center called me when they got the first news of action, combat action. When I got in there to the op center, the first thing they handed me were about a dozen transcripts of the last messages from the Israeli soldiers in the bunkers along the canal. Things like the bunkers collapsed, they're breaking in, stuff like that. Goodbye, Mama. I'd never heard a shot fired in anger myself, and here this stuff, it hit me very hard. Okay, within no more than a couple of hours, we had our first sit-rep out. I didn't know that they were still unsure what was happening down at the Pentagon or down at the Wasig. And I can't jibe my hours with Charlie's hours, but I just know that the fighting was already going on, and we sat down, and people from Charlie's office, people from my office, took everything that we had there. A lot of it was just press reports. Some of it was genuine intelligence. A lot of the combat activity going on was in plain text. We had the means to get a little bit of that stuff, and then we had reports finally from our embassies and our attachés and people like that. So we took everything we had, we ran through it, and we summarized it, we boiled it down, we made some minimal analytic statements about it, and we put it into the teletypes, which is the way we got most stuff out in those days. Some of you may even remember a teletype. And as I say, within about 2 hours, sit-rep number 1 went out. Okay, just to where did the sit-rep go? Who were we addressing with this first report on the situation? First of all, we were reporting the president through Secretary Kissinger. The stuff went down there, it went to the White House, it went to the State Department, and Dr. Kissinger himself got it, or where are you? Yes, Bill Quandt, right there. Especially Bill Quandt would be taking the stuff from our sit-reps, from the Pentagon, from State Department, all the ships at sea, But with some pride, generally speaking, it was the CIA sitrep that was the most comprehensive, the best written since I was its editor, and timely. We put out at least 4 of these things a day. Those first couple of days, we put out probably 6 or 8. They weren't at any scheduled time. Very quickly, as the WASIG got itself organized, Dr. Kissinger himself decreed when we would get the sit-reps to him, and we organized ourselves to meet those deadlines. As I recall, Charlie, because the first item in the sit-rep would be the military situation. That was the most important thing. That was what we had to find out about, and as Charlie has told you, it wasn't easy. We did not have a lot of means, collection means to find these things out. Sometimes we use news reports and they turned out to be accurate enough. Other times we would just have to take the communiques from the 2 parties. Charlie also alluded to a problem there. For a wonder, and very differently, in this war, at least the first few days, it was the Israelis who were minimizing, in fact, underreporting their casualties, their losses. The Egyptians, for a wonder, were not exaggerating the effects of their attacks and were pretty accurate on their losses. It was a wonder to us, but it was for a while there. We didn't do too badly at all, just using the communiques of the 2 sides, and they came with fair frequency, and it made it possible for us to give a pretty good cumulative summary of what was going on. And in no more than a few days, we were putting out a very professional, mostly repertorial product that covered not just that situation in the Sinai and the Golan Heights, but everything that fed into it and that was fed into by this thing. The very first thing Kissinger needed to know was, what's the Soviet position in this? And for the rest of the crisis, that concern was parallel with the situation in the Middle East. Dr. Kissinger, the way I saw it, was always looking over his shoulder. What are the Soviets up to? How is this hitting them? What might they be involved in? What could we, the United States, do that not only would deal with the situation, but do something about our relationship with the Soviet Union? So that Soviet angle was important all the way through. We needed, as the Arab states reacted to this situation, and eventually there was this Arab oil embargo and then a cutting back of Arab supplies of oil that became a crisis all by itself. This brought in economists, and we had some good ones. The economists too were involved in the task that Charlie was telling you about. What were the Soviets shipping in to Cairo and Damascus? And these guys had developed, back during the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, we called them crateologists then, because what they were doing was looking at the size and dimensions of crates and figuring out what was in the crates. We couldn't see inside the Soviet cargo planes that were going in, but we knew what that plane's capacity was. We had a sense of what an army used up in combat, and so we could make some estimates, ballpark estimates, and they were very useful. So these are some of the things, some of the elements of the of the sit reps that made it useful all around the government. Now, our customers, I told you, Dr. Kissinger primarily, and his requirements came back to us. Bill Colby would stop at the our little conference room where we had set up our operation every day before he went down to the White House for a meeting. He would stop there, get the latest SITREP plus any stuff that we'd collected, lake cables or news reports, and that was the basis for his briefing when he got to the meeting. Mostly at the end of every WESIG meeting, he stopped at the operations center and told us what had gone on and asked if there was any new news. And he was Charlie has told you, he was a very easy director to work for, and smart. So those are our principal customers for the SITREP, but there were some others, and some that might surprise you. I had a daily chore of providing a sanitized SITREP to each of the chiefs of reports for two of our operations directors area divisions. The West European division wanted the SITREPs to hand out to pass to their ambassadors. The station chiefs wanted to be able to pass these to their ambassadors, to their clients, to their liaison, sometimes, and who knows what else. The Near East people even more wanted to have the stuff from outside of the Middle East that was in our SITREPs, like the reactions of European governments to the crisis. And the problem was that neither of these essentially collection people wanted to let his precious stuff be sanitized for somebody else. So I had an interesting brokerage job every day. But these things were very useful. It was very useful to the DO to have this premium reporting right from the heart of government in Washington, D.C., where all the real intelligence was coming from. Charlie, I think, referred to briefing some of the congressional committees, and we did make, I don't know that we made SITREPs available to them, but from time to time we would put out special products for them. Attached to the SITREPs would often be some of the products that had been called for from the White House or from some of our other clients. A lot of analytical products went out there. I don't know how many hundred are listed in the program today, but there are. It wasn't the task force that turned out the genuinely analytical stuff. These problems went to the usual production offices, the area offices, the geographers, the economists, and the military people, and the reports were provided directly from them. But they would come through the task force because Mr. Colby would pick them up on his way downtown. That is pretty much what a task force was and what we did. It was, you'll find in some of these documents some pretty nice praise, even from Dr. Kissinger, who is often the agency's severest critic. In this case, the record shows that he was pretty appreciative, and I like to know about that. And I have my 2-minute warning here. Okay, what did we learn from all of this? There were many task forces to come, and people, each time we ran one, we found new things to do, better things to do. But most of all, what we learned from this was from the crisis itself and the failure itself. The document here will show you that almost immediately, Director Colby started taking steps to do something about the flawed analysis that had led us into this situation. And ever since then, and Martha will be able to tell you more about this, because she was not only working on the task force, but in and out for the rest of her career, she has been involved in this high impact, high important problem of getting better analysis, finding better ways to do intelligence analysis. And we've come, I can tell you, a very long way, and I hope she'll be able to tell you something about it. Thank you.
Okay. I am going to try to make 3 basic points. The 3 track with 3 phases of my career, and the first part will address the 1973 war. When I was a brand new analyst, I was a little less than 2 years out of my training. I was still in my probationary period, and I had never been to the Middle East under the aegis of the agency. So I was just maybe 2 steps away from being a bobblehead sitting there trying to learn how to do this work. I was assigned to Libya, and at months before the 1973 war, Libya was in the North African branch of the Middle East Division of OCI, Office of Current Intelligence. And when Egypt and Libya announced a decision to merge their 2 countries, what turned out to be a totally feckless exercise, but one that absorbed an enormous amount of time and was a big distraction because policymakers were quite interested in it, and no one knew whether it would actually happen or not. There had been a precedent of Syria and Egypt merging together. So it was decided at that point that Libya would be moved in with the big guys in the Arab-Israeli office branch. And so I was moved in and following Libya, but our Egyptian analyst was going to the region for the first time in her career. So really in the critical week or so in the run-up to the war, I was also reading the Egyptian traffic as well as the Libyan traffic. I think it's interesting when I looked at the 400 documents that have been released, they were fascinating. They don't give you a feel, however, of those issues that were going on simultaneous with the run-up to the war that were very distracting. And I think many of us have pondered as to whether some of them weren't part of the deception effort. I don't think the Libyan-Egyptian merger was one of them, but there were many others. One that's most prominently talked about was an attack by Saika, a Syrian, wholly Syrian-owned Palestinian terrorist group, on immigrants coming out of the Jewish immigrants coming out of the Soviet Union through Vienna. It was very distracting. I could name 5 others that policymakers were interested in, analysts had to deal with them. So anyway, this was sort of what we were doing. I wasn't quite a bystander, but I was not really as knowledgeable as certainly as Charlie and Dick were in the coverage. And so I had an interesting perspective on how my colleagues were responding and how this all worked. One of the things that hasn't been, I guess Charlie referred to it, after the Soviets removed their dependence from Egypt, which by my lights seemed like an absolute signal of the worst possible sort, we did ask for the chiefs of station in the surrounding countries to come in with their viewpoint on what was going on. and a 7-page report came in from Cairo. And I was one of the first to read it as the Egyptian analyst, and of course passed it on up the line. But it was a very well-written, seemingly well-reasoned, 7-page argumentation for why Egypt was not going to go to war. And in my view, the game was over at that point, because for Washington-based analysts to go up against the guy on the ground was a very steep mountain to climb. And you will find in the documents a remark by Kissinger saying he did not want to hear from the damn analysts in the DI. He wanted to hear from the chief of station on the ground. So anyway, I was called what I thought was the middle of the night. Everybody has a different time frame as to when they were called. I know I was asleep, that I know, and it was very dark outside. And the deputy office chief was speaking in very cryptic terms because we were on an open line. And he said, "This thing has broken open, and you need to get downtown to the State Department," and gave me a room number because we're going to be evacuating American citizens through Libya. And it was a totally stunning phone call. I was hardly compos mentis, but had no idea what it meant to be part of a group that was looking into removing U.S. citizens. So that was sort of what my experience was in the critical run-up that week, and the moment of the thing breaking loose, as it was characterized on my phone call. It was a haunting experience. I was still in my mid-20s, and I watched this thing unfold. I saw what it meant in the aftermath with the oil embargo for the largest transfer of wealth out of the Western world and into the Arab world. And the consequences of what had happened really had a huge impact on me. And I spent a good deal of time with my parents discussing whether I really wanted to stay in a profession where a mistake had such huge consequences. And I was interested in what Andy had to say and what Charlie had to say about how you never really let it go. It stays with you throughout your career. So, fast forward, I got a little bit smarter and found myself as the Egyptian analyst years later. And one of the things that I did in my spare time was I looked back through the record and looked for the context that I thought was missing as a filter for the current intelligence that was coming in during that fateful month of September 1973. And there really wasn't any. Some of the major aspects of Egypt, the contextual aspects of it, were mentioned in the current intelligence, but there wasn't an overarching discussion of where the Egyptians were. And I'm just going to briefly mention what I thought they were retrospectively. The first and most important was that the legitimacy of the Sadat regime was disintegrating by the day. He was living with the legacy of the '67 disaster. He'd had a year of decision in which absolutely nothing happened, and he was really running out of time. The Egyptian economy was very much under stress. Not only were they trying to rebuild after '67, but they had the burden of the cost of the Yemen war, and their population had been asked to sacrifice for a very, very long time. Plus their military, as I understand it, had been more or less mobilized since '67. So there was a certain exhaustion. There was also the humiliation factor. both in the eyes of the Arab world and of the supporters of Egypt in Europe and in the non-aligned world. And the credibility of Sadat particularly was also disintegrating. Another factor which I think was very important was the attitude of the Israelis. They virtually taunted the Egyptians and were extremely arrogant in their discussion of what they were going to do with the Sinai, the building of Yamit, and it was sort of a constant reminder of those horrible failures of '67. But I think the two most important aspects, contextual aspects, that needed to be the filter through which we looked at current intelligence were the fact that détente was not working in Egypt's favor. Sadat felt like he was running out of time. And he also had had a very difficult time eliciting from the Soviets what he needed to rebuild his military. He basically had to do a begging bowl operation, just as Nasser had done. And I think he may have thought he was at the apex of what he was going to be able to throw at the Israelis. So I think that if there had been that construct through which the current intelligence information had been filtered, we would have had a much stronger case in our own minds about whether Sadat was going to go to war or not. I would sort of end that by saying that deception, and this was really good deception, is very, very hard to uncover. And in the wake of 1973 and in the wake of other times when we have been surprised, we've spent a lot of time trying to help analysts understand how to deal with deception. And then finally, the last part of my career has really been engaged in teaching new analytic techniques and tools for dealing with the kinds of things that really we faced in '73, we faced in 2001 during the Iraq War, new ways of looking at information that are more helpful. I've already talked at some length about context. Some of the other tools that we have developed are assumptions checks. Think of what it would have meant to have been able to uncover our feelings that Israelis always win wars, Arabs always lose them, and had a much clearer idea about what our biases and assumptions were. Another tool that I think has been enormously helpful and developed relatively recently is one called analysis of competing hypotheses. And if we had had that tool, where we could have arrayed the various possible explanations for what we were seeing and could have eliminated information that fit every scenario and looked at what we needed to prove one or another and weighted our information, I think we could have done a better job at getting closer to the truth. So I've spent the last part of my career teaching at both the FBI Academy. In the wake of 9/11, they've trained up analysts to use these kinds of tools, and at the agency, and I'm currently at DHS and involved in a program to do the same thing there. So, thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this, what I think is very, very important conference. It's like giving academics all kinds of candies when they look at unclassified documents from so many years back. I started looking at the October '73 war 10 years ago when I was asked to write an article for a book commemorating the 50th anniversary of the DI. And so I was asked to write on the '67 war. I said, well, I would write on that with one condition, if I would be allowed to write on the '73 war. because one is a success and one is a failure, and we need to look at both. And so they declassified 5 documents. Some of them Charlie has quoted. All of them are quoted in the declassified CDs that we got. And I will cite a couple of them. One of them Dick referred to for the 73 war. Then when I was brought into the agency, I had a mission of establishing a strategic expertise in the Middle East as a region and build expertise on political Islam. And in a sense, that was in response to the several failures, the intelligence failures that we've had over the years. My deputy in PISAB was asked to write a major report, which he did, a classified report, on all the intelligence failures in the last 50 years. It was a huge report, and he briefed it all around town. I promoted him from 15 to SIS based on that report. So when we were at the promotion ceremony, I said, how does it feel? He said, I made a career on failure. And in fact, it was a beautiful report about the problems that we've experienced over the years. So in a sense, the 73 war should be taken in context of all those other events as well, and should not be taken in isolation. As Martha indicated, there is a context for that. Now, before I begin, there are 3 statements I would like to make. The first one is that in hindsight, especially 40 years later, our view of what happened or didn't happen is much clearer than our analysts had in the middle of a fast developing story. Now, I think this is not just for charitable reasons, but for real reasons. That in fact, when you are pushed to do current intelligence, you really don't have time to do all that analysis about alternative scenarios, alternative points of view. You would just have to respond. Second, that although all source intelligence, especially collection and analysis, has become much more sophisticated in the last 4 decades, especially with regard to context, leaders' decision-making processes, their intent, motivations, strategic thinking, and this denial and deception. And I think Sadat did a beautiful job from his perspective in deceiving us. And the third is that despite analytic pitfalls and failures over the years, especially regarding the 73 war and many other developments, by the way, including the Arab Spring 2 years ago, intelligence today is more critical for policymakers than ever. That was the case in 73 with President Nixon, and it's the case today with President Obama. Now, I want to focus a bit on the pre-hostilities intelligence. A reading of all of these reports reveals that our analysts at the time, regardless of the reason, did not expect President Sadat to initiate hostilities when he did. Incidentally, the CIA, as Dick pointed out and as Charlie pointed out, was not the only intel agency to misread Sadat's intentions. The Israelis, particularly Mossad and DMI, did the same. As I wrote in that short paper for the DI 50th anniversary book, there is ample evidence in the now declassified documents that our analysts failed to anticipate the breakout of hostilities and frequently attributed Sadat's actions and statements to motives other than war preparation. Now, although context, expertise, and data mining were key to our analysts' efforts at the time to figure out what Sadat was up to, the analysts, unfortunately, were lulled into complacency by a mindset bigger than any individual analyst or team chief that was involved in that operation. And I wanted, looking at that big report that my deputy did on all those failures and on the 73 war, I wanted to kind of just highlight a few of these faulty assumptions on which our analysts have operated and unfortunately led to some of these failures. You can identify more, and they identified a bunch of them. I just wanted to kind of summarize these assumptions. The first, I consider Western logic and analytical mode of thinking. As an example, I will offer one question on each of these. The question that arose at the time was, how could Sadat go to war from such a weak military position, knowing that he would be defeated? It didn't make sense. The second assumption, our Israeli friends' assessment. A question, why would we second guess Israeli Mossad and military intelligence if they judged Sadat was not preparing for war? Third, a benign understanding of Egypt's recent history. For example, as Egypt had conducted military exercises annually and semi-annually in October and May, why should the October 73 exercises be any different? Fourth, a lack of understanding of Sadat's strategic political calculations. We did not focus much at all on his political calculations. What were his political calculations and goals? Ending the Israeli occupation of Sinai, reopening the Suez Canal, disengaging from the Soviet Union in the long run, or getting closer to the United States. And we did not figure out how those four political objectives would serve or would persuade him to go to war, knowing full well he would lose that war. Fifth, a misguided notion of the Middle East culture. For example, how could the Arabs agree among themselves to develop such a daring war plan and yet keep it a secret? If Egyptians could not stand in line to get on a bus, how could they plan to cross the canal undetected and with such precision? It's like one Egyptian soldier, later on, an officer sent a telegram to the West saying, we still cannot stand in line to get on a bus, but we cross the canal. Sixth, acceptance of conventional wisdom and analytic assumptions at face value. For example, why question Sadat's long-term view about the region and strategic attitude toward the US and the USSR when his immediate actions were friendly toward the USSR and critical of the US? Why would we think that really down deep he was interested in getting close to us, or as our ambassador reported to Kissinger the following day from Tehran, that Sadat was really interested in working with us toward a full-fledged peace agreement with Israel. And seventh, we, as Andy made the point and as Martha made the point, we did not ask the question, our analysts, what we didn't know, what we knew half and half, what we thought, and what could happen. We didn't ask these questions at all when we judged that Sadat was not going to war. Now, Charlie had cited a number of these declassified documents. I just want to highlight very quickly 6 examples. May 15, quote, no military indicators suggesting preparations for war. September 30, from a very highly classified report. Quote, in our view, the political climate in the Arab world argues against a major Syrian military move against Israel at this time, end of quote. October 4, we continue to believe that an outbreak of major Arab-Israeli hostilities remains unlikely for the immediate future. October 5, the exercise and alert activities underway in Egypt may be on a somewhat larger scale and more realistic than previous exercises, but they do not appear to be preparations for a military offensive against Israel. October 6, which Dick referred to, prepared October 5 in the evening, for Egypt, a military initiative makes little sense at this juncture of President Sadat's reorientation of domestic and foreign policies. For the normally cautious Syrian president, a military adventure now would be suicidal. Also, October 6, we can find no hard evidence of a major coordinated Egyptian-Syrian offensive across the canal and in the Golan Heights area. Now, I would like to add very quickly that in the post-hostilities period, our intelligence, including the military intelligence, especially a week or 10 days after October 6, did, I think, an extremely commendable job in helping our policymakers figure out what was happening. And I think we really have to kind of divide the two pre-hostilities and post-hostilities. Now, there are a lot of lessons, but looking at all of those reports in the last 40 years that my deputy wrote in that big report, and the 73 war, I just came up with for your interest, with 5 lessons or 6 lessons that our analysts today will find very useful as well. And the first, and again, Martha and Andy alluded to them. The first one is question conventional wisdom. And we are teaching our analysts to do exactly that. Second, hold cultural assumptions and preconceptions at bay. Third, always question other leaders' assumptions and calculations and statements. Sadat was master at that. 4, constantly review the data and explore alternative analytic judgments and explanations. And 5, don't get stuck in a specific analytic paradigm, whether Western or non-Western. In a sense, what we have done at the agency in the last 40 years, whether it's establishing the Political Islam Center or other things, was basically to get at that type of expertise, deep expertise, that would avoid or would help analysts look at these lessons and therefore avoid other failures in the future. You know, the final point I want to make is that the function of theory in social science is to minimize surprise. In the last 40 years, we were extremely surprised at so many things and frequently. I just do hope that we will be less surprised in the next 40 years. Thank you.
This leaves us with about 10 minutes for questions, and I understand we have some microphones ready, and I'm glad we get to do this because it gives you all a chance to participate a little bit. So if a question, show your hand, and one of the gentlemen with the microphone will find you.
As I listened to Dick Kovar saying that the report that they put out on the invasion of Kuwait, you definitely felt that was going to happen. I've read in other quarters, though, that was an intelligence failure. Maybe it was a policy failure. I don't know. What I'm also hearing is that, and I'm asking, I want your reaction. Is there a connection that we don't read that Arab mind quite right? Because Sadat had a losing proposition, as Martha pointed out. It was a very high-risk undertaking. Was he thinking maybe that if he could fight it to a draw, that it was a great political gain for him and it was worth the risk? We underestimated Hussein twice. We didn't think that he would risk war, us going after the WMDs. He would have said, invite your inspectors in, I don't have them. So I look at Hussein, I look at Sadat, I look at Gaddafi, and they're willing to take the long gamble. And it seems to me that maybe we're missing something in that psyche. Is there I'd just like your response. Is there some sort of a psychic profile that these guys defy what we might consider to be a rational decision?
Anyone?
Okay, I'll answer. I think that there isn't any question that it's very difficult to anticipate how any world leader, not just necessarily one outside your culture, is going to respond. That we've had difficulty with the Arab world specifically, I think you're right, we have. And I'll let Emil also speak to that because I think he has a unique perspective. But I once had a conversation with a Sudanese leader named Hassan Turabi, who was an Islamist of he's small but of great magnitude in his beliefs. And he looked at me and he said, "You have no idea how much we're willing to suffer." And I think it is extremely difficult to anticipate that if you don't live it. So, but it's not that we are unaware that we have a challenge in figuring these things out. It's just that it's a very, very hard thing to do. But, Emil?
The first point is that I don't know whether you meant that in your question. I would like very gently to disabuse you of any notion that there is some cultural thing about these leaders that make him decide the way they do. These leaders individually decide what they perceive is in their interest at a particular time. I mean, when you look back at what Sadat did, I thought he was very strategic in his thinking. We did not kind of understand really that strategic thinking of his. In fact, and Bill Quant in the next panel, I'm sure might address that. Even Mr. Kissinger, it took him a day or two to realize, even after the war started, that Sadat was serious. That perhaps we should, who is this guy? And then we realized that he had very serious objectives and he wanted to attain those. He didn't know how to attain those except through going to war and make us and the Israelis take notice of. I think that's an important point to keep in mind about how these leaders behave. Now, the example that Martha used, that's a different story when certain leaders, especially more recently, use Islam and their faith, if you will, to develop certain strategies. That was not the case with Sadat at all. Religion did not play a role in his going to war and dying and going to paradise and meeting 70 virgins up in paradise. That was not what drove him to act at that moment. It was his conception of national interest and his strategic political goals and how to attain.
Sadat was Egypt's Churchill. and he was just as good at deception as Churchill had been.
You're up to your mic.
Oh, do I have a mic? Sorry. Sadat was Egypt's Churchill, and he was just as good at deception as Churchill had been at Normandy. And this isn't a cultural dissonance, as Emil has said. On the Kuwait failure or non-failure, I suggest you talk after Fred Hutchison's presentation in the next hour. Fred's the authority on that. He studied he did a post-mortem on the Kuwait thing. So let him answer that question.
A lot of hands went up, but looking at my watch, I think we only have time for one more. And so there's a microphone back there.
Several speakers have alluded to deception on the part of Anwar Sadat. What specifically are you referring to?
What specifically was said?
Yeah,
on
what was
Deception?
the specific deception? Because everyone's talking about deception. Sadat was the master of deception. What did he do to deceive us?
The most important thing was the entire war plan was kept secret until they actually crossed the canal. And they started planning it months and months and months before. And there's an excellent book called The Road to Ramadan that was written by Mohammed Heikel that
Yes.
outlines all of the steps that they took to hide their intentions from the West and from other Arabs. And it was really quite brilliant, quite surprising that they were able to keep the information concerning their strategy and the buildup and all the rest of it among a very small group of people in Syria and in Egypt. They did it largely under the cover of a military exercise called Liberation 23, which was just supposed to be an exercise. It turned out to be a war.
The berms I told you about, the artificial sand dunes that were built up on both sides of the canal, that was part of the deception. I didn't tell you how they got across those berms. They had ordered a dozen water cannon from East Germany, the kinds of things you use in riot control, and they marched them up to the dunes and they just washed them away.
They had built the dunes.
Yeah,
They had
they
built
built the dunes.
They built the berms
Yeah.
for $30 million. This was a strapped economy, but they built those berms to hide the equipment behind it, and then they blasted through it, and it was like flat ground again.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, and will you join me once again in thanking our panelists?
Thank you. That was good. Thank you. What do you think, boss?